Though, with that said, I'm guessing Ace also has plot armor strong enough to withstand the you've read spoilers because you got one thing right, but I'll ignore the 500 other things you got wrong comments. Hello my fellow weebs and welcome back to the One Piece saga, the series covering my never-ending journey of watching through One Piece for the very first time, giving my thoughts on it and ranking each arc in a tier list to determine which is unquestionably, definitively, and definitely not just in my opinion, the best one. As per usual, if you have any questions regarding the format, the first video in the series will likely answer it. But today we have what may just be the most bizarre arc for me yet, with some of the highest peaks in the series so far, but also my absolute least favorite moments. Though let's not get ahead of ourselves and take a quick look at how the tier list is looking right now. The recently covered post-Enies Lobby arc, despite me wanting to blast it all the way to S+ tier, after careful consideration took the top A tier spot. Though with us heading into the next major story, will Thriller Bark live up to the absolutely stellar arcs that we've had back to back, or will the streak finally end? Well, there's only one way to find out, so let us jump straight into Thriller Bark. The thing I want to mention with Thriller Bark straight away is just how polarizing it was to me. It features a horror-focused haunted mansion type of vibe, which is one of my favorite settings in fantasy, though at the same time, I felt like it never lived up to that. It introduced certain plot elements that seem to go against the vast majority of what we've seen so far, but then it completely offsets that with some of the best character moments in the entire series. All of this is to say is that you should expect a very wide distribution of opinions on this one. While watching this arc, I legitimately went from actively disliking it to loving it, right back to disliking it, rinse and repeat. But alright, let's try to go through it in a somewhat constructive manner. We opened the arc with the usual short moment of the crew just messing around. Though almost straight away, they find themselves drifting into the infamous Florian Triangle, where the tone for the rest of this arc is set. This very much gave off the vibes of those classic stories of haunted waters with ghost ships a la the Flying Dutchman, a setting that is in fact one of my favorites in fiction, so immediately I was extremely excited to see One Piece's take on this type of story. Though since we are talking about the Straw Hats, we see them making fun of Usop and how scared he is, all the while that signature nail-on-chalk, scratchy type of horror soundtrack plays. Honestly, I think I enjoyed seeing this for the nostalgia alone. Telling ghost stories and trying to terrify your friends is one of those experiences that I think everyone can relate to, so seeing it in One Piece was just a ton of fun. Though in story, all their shenanigans are interrupted as a massive tattered ship appears, where we are introduced to the skeleton named Brook. Straight away, I absolutely loved his jazzy vibe, and the fact that we went from literally destroying islands to get crewmates back to Brook just joining the crew almost straight away certainly caught me off guard. Though, as would become trend for this arc, what was an incredibly interesting character, for some reason that I still don't understand, was given a very weird trait of asking to see Nami's underwear. I honestly just don't see why you'd introduce a character that we're supposed to like, and then just give them these sorts of downright bizarre elements. It's a trait that adds absolutely nothing to the character. It's not even like Sanji's chivalry, where his obsession with women comes from him wanting to protect them. For Brook, it's just a completely random thing that, for me at least, is just a substantial flaw of what is an otherwise brilliant character. Though thankfully, it's not a super common thing for him. As for Brook himself, we find out that he has the revive fruit, explaining the whole skeleton thing. Though this alone already made me ask many questions that I doubt I'll be getting any answers to. Firstly, there's quite a bit of talk about how his soul couldn't find its way back from the underworld, thereby confirming that these sorts of things do exist in the world of One Piece. So might we hear more about these sorts of death-related powers? It's now clear that the devil fruits can indeed draw from both the underworld and souls themselves. So perhaps we can get some sort of fruits that can draw in souls, a la the Lich King? Though aside from all that, it makes me wonder about what exactly counts as a second death for Brook. He obviously can't die from something natural like bleeding out, organ damage, or anything like that. So does he pretty much have to be literally shattered? Which brings me on to another question of what happens if your first death involved losing your head. Will you just be a floating head? Alright, now we're getting into some weird territory, so let's just move on. Brook just pretty much works as a lore dump for this first act. Most importantly, revealing that he has lost his shadow and that its holder is somewhere on Thriller Bark. Essentially just laying out the mission of retrieving it in this arc. And I really enjoyed how Brook's introduction was done here. Moments after meeting him, it was pretty clear that he's more than happy to join the crew, but right away, they have to undergo a joint mission that would largely function as his introduction to the crew, which was made even more exciting as this was also Frankie's first proper mission alongside the Straw Hats. So I was super curious to see what kind of team-ups we would get to see throughout the arc. Though pretty much as soon as he reveals the whole shadow issue, he jumps off the ship and runs off to the quote-unquote island by himself. And I suppose we can address this aspect of the story now as well. The reveal that this is not an island, but in fact the world's largest ship, really caught me off guard. But I think it worked as a very elegant solution to all the log post related issues that would have otherwise cropped up. On top of that, I think it added a very interesting dynamic to the arc, where the ship is pushed into some currents, causing the whole fog to dissipate, which in the case of Thriller Bark was obviously a major deal in the story. So yes, the setting overall was a very big W in my book. Once they make landfall, or I guess not landfall since it is a ship, well, anyway, they arrive at the land of the world's most annoying laughs and get split up straight away. And while we won't go through all the shenanigans they get into for the sake of time, I do want to mention a few of the highlights. Nami, along with the appropriately dressed Chopper and Usop, are taken to meet the budget Frankenstein, also known as Dr. Hogback, who, just like the rest of this island's bad guys, has an absolutely horrendous laugh that has haunted me ever since. No, seriously, if I hear any of their laughs again, I will throw my headset straight out of the window. I did enjoy the albeit short subplot Chopper had with him, as I think him getting to meet his idol only to realize that they shouldn't have been looked up to was a great learning moment for Chopper, which would also play into his role later in the arc. Though soon after it becomes clear that most things in this mansion are very much out to get them, and so we get the first of many Scooby-Doo-like scenes in this arc. And this particular aspect of the mansion was one that I was actually super mixed on. As I mentioned, many parts of it felt like classic Scooby-Doo shenanigans, though many of the more serious parts felt a little jarring in that context. We'd go from a super serious scene to an incredibly silly one, and while that's not a bad thing by any means, I do think that in some instances there was a bit of whiplash to that transition, though I do admit that that may just be me. And while we're still talking about the trio, we get the scene that marked the start of quite literally the worst character in One Piece so far. The ghost dude who creeps on Nami while she's bathing. Yes, this was a super uncomfortable scene, but you can look past that. I mean, this guy is supposed to be a villain, so obviously it is a scene that should make you hate him, which it most certainly does. Though the implications of this particular scene later in the arc is what stung the most. More on this in a bit. On the side of Luffy, they also learn a little more about what's going on here and have a run-in with some zombies. Though what was the absolute highlight was Luffy's 300 IQ play here. We see a zombie begin getting out of the ground, only for Luffy to calmly walk up to him and push him back in. This legitimately had me pausing the episode to just laugh at the absurdity of this scene. So yes, this one was most certainly worthy of the shift keys. Soon after, we get the classic horror/comedy gimmick of the crew mistaking an injured old man for a zombie, which again was a great nod to the genre, but more importantly, we are also introduced to this arc's big bad. That being Gecko Moria, one of the 7 warlords. So with that, our quest is set out to defeat the giant Shallot. Though as the crew heads into the mansion itself, we see that despite their overwhelming power, traps and trickery take the upper hand here as slowly but surely, one by one, their frontline fighters are taken, including Luffy himself. This was honestly a super interesting change of pace from the usual structure of the arc, where we'd see the crew fighting off waves of lower ranking enemies and then having their own little matchups with a select few generals, while Luffy heads straight for the boss. Well, here, Luffy is taken out of the running extremely early on, and actually loses his shadow in the process. Speaking of which, I think this gave a great opportunity for Frankie to shine in the first act of this arc, as we see the duo of him and Robin continue their way into the mansion until they run into this absolutely terrifying spider monkey. Or, I guess, monkey spider creature? Anyway, it's also here where we see that Robin can make wings out of her hands, so that's pretty cool. Though despite their best efforts, we see that no matter how much damage they inflict, the zombies will keep getting back up. Which is when Brook comes back into the picture. I really enjoyed how this reveal was handled. We had already heard so much about this humming swordsman, but so far, and I don't know if it's just me being slow, I honestly had no clue as to who that may be. But after seeing that Brook's walking stick is actually a sword sheath, I was extremely excited to see what he's about. I will admit, I am more than a little biased to the trope of a sword cane or walking cane sort of weapon in general, so seeing that being Brook's main weapon was certainly a nice surprise. And on top of that, since his sword is more so a rapier, I was curious to see how his sword skills might differ from Zoro's. Though aside from all that, once he returns we get a whole bunch more lore as Brook explains how the Shallot's Shadow fruit works. In a broader sense, I did enjoy this different approach to the big bad not being just his power alone, but the fact that it's massively increased because of Dr. Hogback. Sure, his shadow magic is strong, but when combined with Hogback's altered bodies, the zombies possess extreme strength. And when you consider the number of soldiers they already have, the real power of Moria becomes much more pronounced. Though, I've gotta be honest, I think by the end of the arc, I was more than a little fed up with his fruit power, as it honestly didn't seem consistent in terms of rules. At first, it just seemed as simple as taking a person's shadow and then putting into a different body. But then it was revealed that he can actually manifest the shadow into a physical thing, and then that he can make the body act according to the shadow, and then that a person can absorb more than one of those shadows, thereby powering up, etc, etc. It just seemed like surprise after surprise that, compared with some of the other devil fruit powers we've seen so far, did seem a little all over the place in terms of what goes and what doesn't. And sure, we have seen a few more complicated fruits, such as Blackbeard's being able to turn off powers, but in the case of Shallot Head, for some reason I wasn't a fan. Also yes, I will keep using Luffy's name for him because I honestly found him very annoying and he does look like a shallot. Though the final thing we learn from Brook is that salt is the key to purifying zombies. So with that, the crew now has a fighting chance. And as it turns out, if I were to find myself in Thriller Bark, I'd be perfectly fine even without a devil fruit power, because I'm always salty. On the side of Shallot Head, we learn a couple of interesting things. Firstly, that he had been defeated by Kaido in the New World. This line seemed way too specific not to be hinting at a character sometime in the future, so I do think this is just planting a seed as to how powerful some of the characters are out there, especially once we see how much of the crew's strength it takes to defeat Moria. Though more importantly, we see that Luffy's shadow will be put into the giant oars. And with that, Shallot Head's big plan is complete. All that's left is to take out the crew one by one. And with that said, I think this is as good of a time as any to talk about said fights. To keep things somewhat straightforward, we're going to apply the Enies Lobby approach and pull away from the chronological order just a bit, and instead go from my least favorite fight to my favorite. First off, the one that I thought was by miles the worst one. Sanji versus the Invisible Dude. Judging by how much I already hated Absalom, I think it should be pretty clear why I was more than a little excited to see him destroyed by Sanji. But then, we get what I legitimately think is the worst quote-unquote twist in the series regarding the main crew. We see Sanji say, "You and I have some bad blood." So picture me, thinking that this is Sanji upholding his values of protecting Nami with everything he's got, and just being so incredibly angry about what he did to her that this whole thing is as personal as it gets. You know, like that time where he got on a train filled with the forces of the world government, and then proceeded to wipe out an entire island to protect one of his own? But instead of that, we find out that the reason he is angry is because it was his dream of getting the clear fruit, and spying on women exactly like Absalom has? What? Are you serious? Why would you ever give the villain's worst traits to the protagonist? And I know some of you will say, yeah, cultural differences and it was supposed to be a joke, but exactly like I said in Alabasta, the fact that this was played off as a joke just makes it worse in my opinion. Honestly, this moment alone seriously damaged Sanji's character in my eyes. And the fact that Nami's character was pretty much reduced to a prop for this sort of payoff just makes that so much worse. Though with that said, I think the only part of the fight against Absalom that I enjoyed was the fact that Nami, with the help of Lola, is ultimately the one to deliver the final blow. Quite literally everything else about this fight was a massive disappointment, especially because the character-centric stories in One Piece are usually so strong. Hello, this is Editing Korotos here. I'll break the fourth wall for a moment. At the time of this recording, I'd already began working on the video, and the post-Enies Lobby video still hadn't gone out, so I'll be talking about the Devil Fruit Encyclopedia, which I still didn't know about. Quite a few of you pointed it out last time, so I guess it's just something I must have missed at some point. Though the point I raise about it is still pretty much the same. Though before we move on, I do still want to return to what Sanji said about the fruits. He mentioned that he read the Encyclopedia of Devil Fruits, meaning that their effects are known. But what about what we saw in Enies Lobby? It was said that the powers hidden within the fruits are unpredictable, and since all fruits are unique, why is it that some can be deciphered but not others? They seem to follow exactly the same rules, so it honestly feels low-key convenient. On top of that, based on what we saw in post-Enies Lobby, I thought that Blackbeard knowing what the effects of his fruit would be was some sort of discovery that he had made. But if they're just listed in a book, that does remove a lot of the intrigue surrounding them in my opinion. Though with that said, I am still open to hearing why some of them have their effects known and some don't. If the explanation makes sense, then just ignore this point. If I were to make a guess, I suppose a viable explanation could be that depending on the complexity of the fruit's ability, they can't be deciphered. Which would make sense in this case, since its ability is pretty straightforward. Though that isn't really the case for Blackbeard's fruit. So that theory doesn't really hold. I suppose another way of thinking could just be writing it down to Vegapunk. With what we would see very shortly with the Pacifista and what we'd already heard from him, it's clear that he is very crafty when it comes to making the world government stronger. So when he gets involved, there really are infinite possibilities as to why. But yes, in short, I am very curious to find out what makes them different. Next up, we have Chopper versus Hogback. And as if the budget Frankenstein wasn't unlikable enough, we find out that the room filled with Sindri's pictures was actually his, i.e., he too is an absolute creep. So yes, Chopper teaming up with Robin to take him down and free Sindri was awesome to see. Though once again, I do have to bring up the whole shadow magic thing, as here too, it felt a little inconsistent. Yes, in story, it was a great moment that Sindri was able to take control of her body once Chopper breaks through to her, but in a broader sense, it does go against the rules of the fruit that we had seen so far, which did seem absolute. Though yes, even with that said, the scene where she just starts crying after Chopper calls to her was super emotional, and does a great job of showcasing how Chopper's empathy and caring nature as a doctor, despite maybe not having the extensive experience of Hogback, does make him a better doctor, and perhaps more importantly, just a better human being. Next up, and I'll be honest, you can just think of these two as tied for first place, we see Brook versus his shadow. While I would have loved to see a little more of Brook himself going up against it, I do suppose that his expertise isn't just one-on-ones as it is for Zoro. And with that said, he can't keep up with the shadow, so Zoro takes over and we get a fantastic fight between them. Though just before the fight even begins, we find out that this swordsman is from Wano, and that he has one of the 21 Owazamono swords. Yes, I know I butchered the pronunciation. Full transparency, I have heard that Wano is a thing in the comments, but that is all I know. Just the name and nothing more. Not sure if it's an island, a ship like we see here, or whatever. Though I do suppose I can theorize just a teeny bit since these two things were mentioned almost back to back. When Shallot Head was talking about ores, he mentioned that he was defeated by Kaido in the New World. So, is it a stretch to think that both ores and Brook's shadow dude came from his attack on Wano? Maybe Wano has more of these kinds of giants, or maybe Wano has an extremely powerful military with said giants and master swordsmen. These are obviously complete shots in the dark, so I don't think it's worth wasting time here. I think my favorite aspect of the duel was what Brook himself said. The Wano swordsman was holding back while fighting him, but now that he is going up against Zoro, he's realized that the both of them possess incredible strength, and as such, this fight will not last long. The first one to get a strike in will win. And I absolutely love this sort of duel. As I said in Eni's lobby, I felt like Zoro's fight there was a bit too dragged out and the back and forth just went on too long. So this sort of sudden death type of matchup was right up my alley. And when the fight is over and we just see him say, "I have lost," was also brilliant. Though the question arises, why did his wound catch fire, and blue fire at that? If I were to apply some basic physics, that would just mean that he's burning hotter than normal flame, or a complete combustion of gas. None of which really make too much sense. On the flip side though, blue fire in fiction is sometimes associated with the devil that sets it apart from normal orange flames. So maybe this is something stemming from Zoro's cursed blade? We have seen a few things here and there, but as far as I know, the whole cursed part of it still hasn't really been explained. But anyway, seeing the Wano guy calmly say that his sword will be in good hands with Zoro was an absolutely awesome end to the fight, and a nice change from the villains usually refusing to go down even after they've been thoroughly beaten. But with that, Zoro has acquired another legendary sword and Brook has gotten his shadow back. So yes, all in all, a great fight. Next up, we have the absolutely awesome duel that was Usop versus the Ghost Girl. First off, her Devil Fruit was such an interesting and frankly powerful ability. I mean, she has shown that she can take on Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, or basically anyone else in a matter of seconds. Though because Usop has a negative personality, he can take her hits head on. Though aside from all that, seeing a trickster versus trickster type of fight was also a very welcome change. Usop does of course still use plenty of his special attacks, though much of the fight is a back and forth in terms of wits. And just in case you didn't notice those Scooby-Doo vibes before, Usop being chased by her bear is straight out of a classic Scooby-Doo episode. Though yeah, the fight culminating in Usop just scaring her until she passes out was a ton of fun. No pun intended. and also worked to show just how much tougher Usop has gotten through the Water 7 saga. Oh, and the fact that we would later see her poofed out of existence rather than just beaten or escaping like the rest, makes me hope that her story isn't quite over. With how unique her power was, I would love to see more of her. The same can't be said for Shallot Head and the rest though, but more on that in a bit. Though finally, we have the big one, the entire crew versus Luffy's shadow. If I'm being totally honest, I did not enjoy the fight itself that much due to the aforementioned rules of the Shadow Fruits. I mean, the whole Nightmare Luffy thing was fun, though it honestly was kind of underwhelming since it's just a temporary power-up that doesn't really stem from Luffy's power or anything like that. Though what I loved about this fight is that it takes the entire crew to finally beat Oars. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the first time that we've seen literally every member of the crew chain together their techniques and knowledge to beat a singular foe. And as such, seeing Chopper use his medical knowledge to find Oars' weaknesses, and then the crew one by one exploiting them was just a ton of fun to see. Then of course Shallot Head enters his second phase where he absorbs all the shadows, and this moment was great in the sense that it perfectly demonstrated why he was beaten. Because he didn't have to do that. If he were to just chill out until the sun came up, the crew would have been literally wiped out of existence and he'd win. So him ultimately going down like a screaming baby was very much in line with what I would expect from his character. As for Luffy, we see him use both second and third gear at the same time, which once again pushes him to the point that his body just shuts down once the fight is over. And we even get a scene of Usop saying that he feels very bad about Luffy constantly pushing himself that far. But in terms of Shallot Head, that's that. And now we get into the parts that did a fair bit of carrying for this arc. Just before the fight actually goes down, we see another warlord by the name of Tyrant Kuma arrive at Thriller Bark. And straight away he begins to drop bombshells. First of all, saying that Blackbeard would be replacing Old Crocky as the 7th warlord. This obviously has absolutely massive implications, as that means he now has a certain degree of power over the Navy as well. But with everything that went down in Post-Tenny's lobby and the mention of him here, something tells me we'll have plenty of time to talk about him at length very soon. Though, I guess my three-way war theory is out of the window, since he's now at least in some part allied with the Navy. That is of course unless he plans on overthrowing them just like he did with Whitebeard. More on this in a bit. But after Moria is defeated, he just pops up in front of the crew and says that his mission is to obliterate everything on Thriller Bark. And sheesh, did I love this approach to the story. Just when I thought the fight was done, nope, another even stronger enemy appears. This is like the definition of that meme where you defeat a boss and a new health bar pops up. Though on top of that, this isn't the Straw Hats going after someone. He's here to catch them. So it's just a back-to-back blasting, and it once again was a sobering experience that showed us the wider scope of things. The Straw Hats still have a long ways to go in this world. Though we are told that he reflects gusts of air at the speed of light. And yeah, no, that's not going to hold up. I'm calling it now. If someone dodges an attack at the speed of light, I'm calling shenanigans. Saying anything moves at the speed of light is a big no-no in my book. As in my experience, that never holds, since if you ever want to beat it, you would have to move faster than the speed of light, at which point it just gets silly in terms of power escalation. And at that point, time dilation comes into play and it just gets absolutely silly. As for his power, they are super mysterious. Obviously he has his devil fruits, and we find out that he was basically created as a killing machine. Though that does not explain his ability to warp, for example. So I'm very curious to see what that's about. How did he even get to Thriller Bark, and where does he go afterwards? Teleportation sounds very OP, but that seems to be what he does? And on top of that, since we now know that this is indeed a project that the government is working on, I wouldn't even be surprised if we see these sorts of super high-tech cyborgs pop up sometime in the future as well. Though at the same time, they couldn't have Kuma's fruit power, which seems fairly crucial what he's here to do, so how would that work? But his vanishing power is definitely a weird one. And if memory serves me right, this is pretty much the first of its kind. As far as theories go, based on what we see here, I'd be more inclined to believe that he actually traps them somehow. Judging by his name, it would make sense as to how he can win the fights for the government, yet still remain a pacifist. So maybe he shrinks his enemies and traps them in a sort of a Pokeball? That would definitely be incredibly powerful, but does leave room for a comeback, since maybe you can still break out. But that doesn't really make sense in terms of his attack power. Since that was to repel gusts of air at the speed of light, maybe they're not actually vanishing but are just sent flying faster than the speed of light so you never see it. Though that would most certainly not be a pacifist attack and would definitely kill them. So is this whole pacifist name supposed to be ironic? I mean, he is a killing machine. Hello, this is Editing Korotos once again. While editing this together, I was listening back to literally what I myself wrote, and the only thing I could think of was, you just said that he might send people flying, but couldn't piece that together and figure out that he sends himself flying instead of teleporting? So that is my other line of thinking, that he doesn't actually teleport, he just moves very, very fast. Though again, the whole speed of light thing is kinda timey-wimey shenanigans, so I don't know how I feel about that. Other than that, I've seriously got no idea. From now on, every single bogus theory shall be attributed to Vegapunk, so I am also expecting a mechanical Godzilla soon. In story though, he explains that he'll spare everyone for Luffy's head. Though Zoro, being the absolute Chad that he is, steps in and says that he will offer up his instead. And then Sanji steps in saying that he may not have the highest bounty, but he is Blackfoot Sanji and should be taken out as soon as possible before he causes trouble. I mean, this was just an incredible moment to symbolize just how tight-knit this group is. Every single one of them would be willing to give their lives for each other. And Sanji stepping in for Zoro is the perfect example of that. We've seen them essentially hate each other, but he just casually says that Zoro should give the crew his regards, and that he's sorry they'll have to look for another cook. And yes, that was amazing, but just like I've said countless times already, there were zero stakes. Both of them have plot armor that is stronger than those paper armbands, and everyone knows it. Though ignoring that, Zoro does manage to broker a deal after all. He would spare them, but in return, Zoro must suffer all of Luffy's anguish that he experienced during the fight. So he picks up Luffy, compresses all of his exhaustion and injuries into a single cloud, and leaves for Zoro to absorb. Though not before giving him a tiny piece to have a taste. And that single bit almost ends him already, though regardless, he says fine and goes for it. We then cut to everyone regaining consciousness, most of all Luffy, who is completely back to normal, leaving everyone stunned as to how that's even possible. Though once Sanji awakens and notices Zoro's swords, he obviously fears for the worst and runs off to find him, only to find him standing there and bleeding from literally everywhere. And when he asks what happened, Zoro just says, "Nothing happened." Wow. Scenes like this are why he's still my favorite member of the crew. And the absolutely best part of it, almost no one on the crew actually knows what he did for them. And he never mentions anything about it to anyone. Though I think the fact that Sanji would later learn about what happened there is very important for finally strengthening their bonds. As I said before, we know that they essentially hate each other. But following something like this, I mean, you've gotta respect him, right? And ditto for Zoro, it's not like Sanji didn't step up either. The both of them saw very directly that they would give their lives for each other. And when you think about it, we don't even know how long or how much he suffered there. He just took that head on. And something tells me that this event will come into play later, because you don't walk away from something like that unchanged, do you? And I'm not sure whether this was intended or not, but this seriously reminded me of his fight with Hawkeyes, and how he yelled out to Luffy that he will never lose again. And like I said with Tyrant, since we now know that the new world is even more cutthroat than what we've seen so far, this defeat basically becomes another goal to reach for. And even aside from all of that, I love how this implicitly also says a ton about Luffy. It is of course Zoro who sacrifices himself for the crew, though all of that suffering was Luffy's, and he was going to carry it without ever saying a word. And like we saw with Sanji, they would all do this with zero hesitation. And with that said, in my eyes, aside from what I mentioned about it being zero stakes, this was a perfect sequence in terms of emotion. But yes, the only people who know what happened here is Sanji, Robin, and Brook. And because we were shown so explicitly that Robin was snooping on the conversation, I feel like it will definitely be brought up at some point. And just before we move on to the part you already know was the highlight of this arc, I want to talk about the animation, since we've been talking about CG etc. throughout the series. I noticed that it was very inconsistent here. The Ace vs Blackbeard fight in Post-Enies lobby was incredible in terms of animation, especially the shading work. Ditto for here when Zoro stands in front of the paw guy. Though through much of the arc, I noticed that the general quality of it decreased, especially in the shading department. Obviously this doesn't affect my thoughts on this arc at all, it's just an observation. One of you on Twitter pointed out that this is just a case of multiple studios working on the series, so if any of you have some more input on that, I'm just curious to find out more. But then we get to the party at the end of the arc, and just wow. Yo ho 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 definitely hits different now. All of this starts with the great shot of Luffy chilling on the piano and asking Brook whether he wants to join his crew, only for Brook to respond that he already has a mission to get back to a friend. That friend being Laboon. So yes, when I said, though we get one final scene that really made me a lot more confident in my theory that the pirates who befriended Laboon were Gold Roger's crew. So yes, when I thought that Roger was Laboon's friend, I was indeed wrong. It was Brook and his crew. And the attention to detail here was actually impressive. I cross-checked the ship that appeared in Reverse Mountain, and it's very similar, so props for that. Though unlike the rest of the flashbacks we've seen so far, this one was masterfully woven through the present, as Brook is playing the piano, and all of that was honestly just heartbreaking. Like how the song was once extremely cheery, but once he hums it in Thriller Bark, it's so somber and dark. And then of course there's the absolutely tragic and extreme juxtaposition of them playing one last song together as they literally fall over dead. And that scene of Brook just saying, it's a quartet, a trio, a duo, and solo. It was honestly just hard to watch. And it is most certainly deserving of an, albeit very sad, but a chef's kiss nonetheless. I don't think there's much of an argument to be had when I say that this was definitely one of the most tragic backstories we've seen so far. And once again, I know you're probably sick of this by now, just made me think about how brilliant Oda is at writing tragedy. Death is so commonplace in flashbacks and is a backbone to basically every member of the crew. The people they've lost shaped who they are today. So again, it just makes me incredibly sad that we don't get any of that in the present day. In fact, I'll be completely honest. You know when we saw Ace's hat on the ground after his fight with Blackbeard? The thought of him potentially being dead only crossed my mind when I had already finished editing that video. That's how much I take their plot armor for granted. And again, yes, this isn't Game of Thrones, I know. But like I said, it's so common and so brilliantly written in flashbacks that I genuinely don't see why it never appears in the present story. But regardless, Brook's backstory was nothing short of excellent. Everything from their relationship with Laboon, to the tragic passing of their captain and later his entire crew. Which leads me around to what I mentioned when we first saw him. He is obviously a very complex character with lots of emotional baggage. And for some reason, that is tainted by his weird panty thing. It's not like he's missing a comedic sign. That's what all of his skeleton puns are for, which, albeit sometimes pretty dumb, are great. So, like I said, I just don't see any reason whatsoever why you'd write that in. Though with that said, he formally pledges himself to the Strawhat Pirates and lets them know that he already has a solid 33 million bounty. So yeah, the already massive bounty of the crew just went up quite a bit. But just before we leave the island, or ship I guess, we see that Frankie has built a grave for his crew where he plays their favorite song one last time. Though he is joined by Zoro, who says that he's also here to lay his Yubashiri to rest. And knowing that Brook saw what went down with him seriously changes the way I viewed this scene, as he obviously has massive respect for his sacrifice. And he does go to say something to Zoro, but never finishes that. So again, I think it will be brought up at some point. And the very last thing to bring up is the Vivre card Lola gives to Nami. Speaking of which, I think I've glossed over Lola this arc, but her dynamic with Nami, or Namizo, was brilliant all around. So there's my one sentence summary of that. Definitely hope we can see her pop up sometime again. Though in short, we find out that these Vivre cards pull to each other, so you can't tell how far the other person is or anything like that, but it does point you to their general direction. Though much more importantly, they are an indicator of the vitality of its holder. And oh, if I hadn't said enough dumb things this video, prepare, because it is most certainly time for theories. We of course know that Luffy was given one of these by Ace back in Alabasta, a thing that Nami points out as well. Though when Luffy goes to look at it, we see that it is literally burning up, which coincides with what we know from his duel and what we learned before with Shallot heads. He's being held for execution in Impel Down. Luffy and the crew don't know that yet, and right now Luffy just brushes it off saying that Ace wouldn't want him to interfere with his troubles anyways, and that he'll be fine. But oh boy, is this a Chekhov's gun if I have ever seen one. This is Luffy we're talking about. No way he's just going to brush off his brother. So for me, this is the final piece to my full-on war theory I've been going on about. You know how when I was talking about Brook, I said deaths in the present story? Well, what is a better transition to the new world than a war sparked by the to-be Pirate King brother's death? Though, with that said, I'm guessing Ace also has plot armor strong enough to withstand the you've read spoilers because you got one thing right, but I'll ignore the 500 other things you got wrong comments. So I'd say he does still survive in some bogus manner. If you want my more realistic theory, it goes like this. Luffy checks the paper to see it almost burns and somehow finds out that Ace is held for execution. I'd wager this is Nami reading a newspaper or something like that, similar to what happened in Alabasta with Vivre. That then prompts the crew to head over to Impel Down, but they are not the main force there. Instead, we see Whitebeard going in and saving Ace, who is on the very brink of death. For dramatic effect, we can even make the piece of paper literally a single ember, thereby faking out both Luffy as well as us as the viewer. And this would also solve the issue of Impel Down being a location that should be impossible for the crew to just bulldoze over. So if it's not them actually spearheading the attack, I think it would make more sense, as we've already been told that Whitebeard's power is literally through the roof. And since we now know that the Vivre cards are a thing, that basically solves the entire log post problem of them only pointing forwards, as Whitebeard could also have a direct guide to Ace just like Luffy does. And obviously, they siege Impel Down, that by default pretty much starts a war. And Blackbeard is already on the side of the Navy, so that works. But yes, let's see how this one ages. As for Nami though, her Vivre card leads her to Lola's mother, who is apparently an extremely powerful pirate as well. Though that is quite literally all we hear about her, so I don't think there's anything else to draw from. But it's just another seemingly important character that is added to what is already a story with so many moving pieces that my brain is beginning to fry. And you know I love every second of it. Though with that said, the crew sets off, but not before we are casually told that Thriller Bark wasn't the horror of the Florian Triangle, as these massive shadowy figures appear. And like, what? What do you mean? This is literally the says something important, refuses to elaborate meme. I mean, they look to resemble those things we saw way back in Jaya, so I'm assuming they're in some way connected? But come on, I need to find out more like right now. What is this? What? But that's the end of that? And yes, I guess that is Thriller Bark. As I think I've made it pretty clear, this one was super hit and miss for me. Things like the Sanji fight seriously damaged the character in my eyes, while on the flip side, we got what I think is among my favorite flashback stories in the series, and immediately made me invested in Brook's character, not to mention Zoro's nothing happened moments. Though on the flip side once again, Shallot Head was not a villain I liked seeing at all, and if it wasn't for Ghost Girl, the Wano Samurai, and later Tyrant Kuma, the fights in this one would have been pretty lackluster. At the same time, I absolutely love the, albeit silly, horror setting, and if anything I would have loved to see more of it. So yeah, I think it's clear that my thoughts are all over the place for this one, and fittingly, I think it will be taking the C tier. Though the very top position, as there were still plenty of things that I did actually enjoy. But with that said, next time we continue our way to Fishman Island in the Sabaody Archipelago arc. And that's the video. Bit of a meta thing that I'd love to hear your take on since you've made it all the way here. Did you notice any changes in today's scripting? I tried a bit of a different approach to make the subsections of the video flow a little nicer, as I think the chronological approach might be a bit too much for these longer arcs. And that coincides with the whole time codes being available for more specific sections. So do drop your opinions in the comments. And one more thing, I wanted to quickly update you on why this one is a tad bit late. I'm working upwards of 100 hours per week right now, so production time has been seriously cut down. This will continue through to March, so I do hope you stick with me through this slump. I'm low-key turning into a zombie myself, but I guess that's life. Other than that, as usual, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Speaking of which, let us give a warm welcomes to the newest members of the team, Kasu Crow and Drifting Dreams. Seriously, thank you. And if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as 1 buckaroo per month. And last but not least, let us do the usual test to see how many of you have stuck around until the very end. Leave a comment, whatever it may be, and include the words, "Actually, something did happen." Let's see what you come up with. Other than that, if you enjoyed the video, please share it and click all the YouTube buttons. But now, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.